Today I'm ready to continue the Ancient Pottery Challenge by making that Mesa Verde mug. This is going to be the smallest pot in the Ancient Pottery Challenge this season, but that doesn't mean it's not complicated or challenging.
Oh, son of a gun!
Here's the tools you're going to need if you want to follow along. I have a work board, a flat board to build the pot on. I have a gourd scraper, a polishing stone, a little piece of buckskin. I have this homemade needle tool, but any kind of cutting tool will work. I have a tape measure, and that's because this is a replica, and I'm going to try to get it as close to the size of the original as I can. A water bowl to keep my pot wet as I work, and I've got a lid from my kitchen that I've measured to be the size that I want the base to be before it shrinks. So the pot we're making today has a diameter of about 4 inches and a height of about 4 inches. So you have to also think that that clay is going to shrink a little bit and make it a little bit bigger so that hopefully once it's all dried and fired, it's pretty close to the size of the original. And last but not least, I have a nice block of gray clay that I'm going to form the mug from. I'm going to start by patting out a little slab of clay and then using that lid to cut it into the circle the size I want. You know, the ancient people probably did something very similar. Although they didn't have lids like this, they certainly had circular things they could have used as a form. Baskets, gourds, all sorts of things, other pieces of pottery. So even though they didn't have plastic lids, they certainly could have used something similar. Now to begin with, you've got to make sure you get that first coil bonded really well. Now this is something I brought up when I did the Chaco cylinder. That first coil is really important that it get bonded because it's easy for it not to, and then later it cracks or the bottom wants to come off. So make sure you get it good and attached, and then also you want to smooth that inner joint, you know, where the coil attached, that seam joint, because as soon as you get like 2 coils on there, it can be hard to get your hand down in there to work. So do it now while it's short, because it's going to be harder to work down in there later. Time for the second coil, and we're just going to attach it, and then I'm going to show you how I'm pinching this. Because I want those sides to go vertical, I'm not just pinching it flat between my thumb and forefinger. I'm also doing a little compression, pulling my hands together a little bit. You can see that there, trying to make those sides vertical. And even at that, I didn't do it enough. You can see that the walls of the pot are coming out a little bit. It's got a little bit of that flower pot shape. And so here I'm coming back and doing more compression just to pull it in and make those walls vertical, to make it as cylinder shaped as possible. And of course, scraping the inside to get rid of that coil seam. And those nice long vertical strokes on the outside to make the wall straight and smooth and cylindrical. And this will be my final coil. So the way I do pots like this, little small pots, is I build them up beyond the level I want them at, and then I will trim it down to the right size. So I'm well beyond what it needs to be. Remember that the original, the barrel of the original is 4 by 4 roughly, and so it doesn't need to be very tall. A lot of the techniques I'm showing here are the same ones I did on that Chaco cylinder jar, which was the last pot I did in the Ancient Pottery Challenge. So building a cylinder in the same way, except in this case it's very much shorter. But I'm now going to start pushing out that shape. So even though I built it as a cylinder, it's not going to stay a cylinder. This is more of a barrel-shaped pot. And so as you see, I went inside with my gourd scraper and I pushed out the bottom. And now I'm using my fingers to just kind of gently push it out where I need it to give it a nice rounded bottom, and then kind of have it taper up gently at the top. So just spending some time here, getting the shape right. And now I'm ready to measure it and trim off the rim. And once I have it cut down to the right size, that's just the beginning. Because the rim is one of those things that it behooves you to take your time to make sure the rim is nice and even and smooth. And so I spend a great deal of time trimming down high spots, adding little bits of clay in low spots, getting it nice and wet so I can just kind of mold it into the shape I want, and then finally using my wet piece of buckskin to just go over it and smooth it off, nice and finished. And then before I let this rest and firm up a little bit, I'm going to use this long-handled spoon to just push out a few dents. Round 2. Now that it's dried a little bit, it's firmed up, it's ready to be handled a little bit, I'm ready to start working on the bottom. So I want that bottom really rounded. I'm going to start by trimming off some of the excess using my needle tool. And then, once I've done that, I'm going to be able to pick it up and trim it a little more precisely. And then before you finish up here, make sure you've got the shape just the way you want it. Again, pushing out dents with that spoon, because pretty soon it's going to be too firm to really mold. And this little session here is just to kind of deal with that rough texture that I was left with after I trimmed around the bottom. So I'm just coming back with that wet deer rib and just smoothing it off, scraping it down, and then using my wet finger to just make sure it's nice and smooth and even. I'm even filling in some little dents with small bits of clay, just to make sure the bottom is all done. Now I'm ready to let it dry. In this Ancient Pottery Challenge for Season 5, I am recreating 7 ancient pots from the northern Southwest. These 7 beautiful pots were all made by people in the culture formerly known as Anasazi. This mug is the 5th of the 7 pots. The previous 2 black on white pots I made as part of the Ancient Pottery Challenge this season were decorated with mineral paint. But mineral paint only accounts for a portion of the Anasazi black on white pottery made in ancient times. Much of this pottery was decorated with organic paint, that is to say, paint that is made by boiling down plants into a thick syrup. If this organic paint is applied to the right type of clay, smectite, and fired in the right way, with a minimum of oxygen present, then it will result in black carbon designs on the pot when it's done. The Mesa Verde area has a long history with black on white pottery, starting around 550 AD. But at first it was almost entirely decorated with mineral paint, similar to the way I made the Tularosa and Chaco black on white pots earlier. But by 1100 AD, the Mesa Verde potters had mostly switched over to using organic paint on their black on white pots. Organic paint has certain advantages in that it's relatively easy to make with local materials, while mineral paint is often dependent on acquiring certain minerals through trade. However, organic paint can be harder to get right because it requires that the potter have access to a white smectite clay slip and that the pottery be fired in just the right way. Fortunately, these white smectite clays are not uncommon on the Colorado Plateau, where the Mesa Verde region is located. And the Mesa Verde potters definitely had the skills to successfully fire these organic painted pots. In fact, a number of these potters would get together to fire massive trench kilns full of their black on white pottery, a display of technical skills unequaled in ancient America. I'll talk more about their way of firing later on in this video. Okay, it is time to add the handle. First thing I'm going to do is make sure that clay I'm using is really damp, because as soon as I start rolling it out, I'm losing moisture into the workboard. And as it sits in the air, I'm losing moisture. So I always start wetter than I want. I roll out a coil, I flatten the coil. These are not pulled handles. The ancient potters did not pull handles in the modern sense. Now I'm just making sure that the length is right. I'm going to hold it up there and trim some off several times until I make sure I've got the length about right. I think I made the handle a tiny bit too short, but if you look at the original, the handle was fairly short. It's like a 1 or 2 fingered handle. It's not a 3 or 4 fingered handle. Now these are called rivet handles. This is the way a lot of the ancient mug handles were attached. They aren't just attached to the outside. The handle actually passes through the wall of the mug to make for a very strong joint. So I'm cutting a hole in the side of my mug, and I will pass the end of my handle through that hole and then use my finger to flatten that off on the inside. A rivet handle attachment. And I'll do the same thing, of course, on the top. And then I'll show you how I attach it on the inside. You can see there's a little plug of clay there. That's the end of my handle. I'm just using my finger to smooth that out. And then I'm taking little balls of damp clay and just pressing them into the gaps around the outside to make a nice, smooth, strong handle attachment. And that's it. My mug is formed. After it dries a little bit more, it'll be ready to slip. Looking for the right white slip material. There it is, cannonball. This comes from southwest Colorado. This is stuff that may very well have been used by the ancient Mesa Verde potters. So I'm just going to put it in this little dish, put some water on top of it, and let it sit for a few hours. Then, when I come back, it's soaked up all the water, and I can mix it up. The consistency I'm looking for is something maybe a little thinner than yogurt. Fairly thick, but not too thick. And then I'm just going to apply it to the outside of the mug with a brush. I won't slip the inside, only the outside, but I will slip the bottom. Now, in the past, I've left the bottoms unfinished on these Mesa Verde mugs, but I recently learned that most Mesa Verde mugs are slipped and polished on the bottom. So that's what I'm doing here. Now, that's the first coat. I'm going to let that sit and firm up for a few minutes, and then I'm going to come back and apply a second coat. That's all it needs. You're still going to be able to see that gray clay shining through, but once it's fired, you will not see that. The last step before painting is polishing. Now, I don't want to make it glossy in this case because these Mesa Verde mugs are not polished to a gloss. They're just polished so that they have a nice, smooth texture. Feels good in your hands. And that's just going over it once with this smooth stone. Now, you're going to want to do this at just the right stage of dryness. Too dry, you're going to scratch it. Too wet, it's going to stick to your stone. To start with, I need to rehydrate my organic paint as soon as possible, at least a couple of hours before I'm actually going to start painting, because it takes a while for it to kind of soak up the water and you can mix it to a desired consistency. In this case, the organic paint I'm using is made from Ricky Mountain Beeplant. This is traditionally believed to be the material that the ancient Mesa Verde potters used, although nobody actually knows for sure because there's no evidence in the archaeological record. That's just what the native potters in the Southwest use for organic paint. You'll see that I got a few little crackles on here from getting the slip too thick. This is a hard thing to avoid, and what makes me feel a little better is that the ancient pot I'm replicating actually has some of these crackles as well. Down here and over here where the handle comes in. So similar places, they also got their slip a little too thick. But that's something you definitely want to avoid when you're applying your slip. Now, this organic paint is really sticky stuff, and so the difficulty is not sticking your fingers in it and trying to get it to dry up so that you can kind of handle it as you move it around. So my little trick is to put it outside. Of course, this is done in August. It's nice and hot outside. If it's not hot, this isn't going to work. You can also put it in a warm oven, put it next to a fireplace. Just put it someplace warm, and that paint will dry up and be kind of hard and plastic-like, and then you can handle it. I've used a tape measure to subdivide it into 4 equal spaces for the design. If that bothers you, you want to use something that seems more what the ancient potters would have used, you can use a piece of string, anything. You can measure that distance out, divide it into 4 equal segments, and then mark it with just a little tick. And then that little tick that I drew on with paint just gets covered up as I paint it. Over most of the American Southwest, we know little to nothing about how the ancient people fired their pottery, because archaeologists have found almost no kilns or other evidence of firings. The only evidence we have of pottery firings in most areas is the pottery itself, which is abundant enough to make the lack of firing features seem odd. The one outstanding exception is in the Four Corners region, where the Mesa Verde potters were using stone-lined trench kilns, hundreds of which have been identified. These simple kilns run about 2 to 4 feet wide and from 5 to 25 feet long. Can you imagine the quantity of pottery it took to fill a trench that was 25 feet long? That's why we think that these were communal kilns, where several potters fired their work together. Another interesting fact about these trench kilns is that they were located far away from settlements, sometimes miles away from the nearest village. Maybe this is because firewood was more abundant out there, or maybe these kilns were located where the airflow was just right for a successful firing. This also brings up the question of whether they carried all their unfired pottery all the way out to these remote kilns, or perhaps they were making the pottery out there near the kilns. Although these sorts of features had been known to archaeology for years, it wasn't until the early 1980s that they were positively identified as kilns. But knowing what they are does not equal knowing how they work to produce reduced whiteware pottery. So in 1991, pottery replicators and archaeologists came together at Crow Canyon Archaeological Center in Cortez, Colorado to try to figure out how to fire a trench kiln in a first-of-its-kind event called the Kiln Conference. By 1993, the code had been cracked by replicator Clint Swink, and he published his findings and outlined his now famous 4-step process for firing a trench kiln. Today, the Southwest Kiln Conference, as an outgrowth of that original kiln conference, is still going strong and firing pottery every year using Swink's 4-step process. Please consider joining us on September 27th through the 29th, 2024 at Crow Canyon Archaeological Center in Cortez, Colorado, where we will meet to fire pottery like the ancient people of the American Southwest. I'll put more information about the Kiln Conference down in the doobly-doo. All right, it's August and it's a hot one. It's not only hot out here today, it's pretty humid too, so I'm sweating like a pig. I apologize for that. But I had to get this done. I got to get the video done. So, you know, and the weather was good enough that the wood was dry, hadn't been rained on for a couple days. So now this is my first Mesa Verde style firing that I've ever done. Now I've seen a lot. I've watched them up at the Kiln Conference and other places, but I've read all the literature about them, but I've never done one. So this is going to be a little different in a couple of ways. First of all, I'm not in the Four Corners area. I'm far to the south in southern Arizona, so the environment is quite different. The wood I'm using is quite different. It's mesquite wood. Up there, they would have been using juniper wood for their fuel. Those kilns, those trench kilns, are rectangular. I've got a circular hole in the ground. I've only got 2 pots to fire, though. They would fire a lot of pots in those big rectangular kilns. I only have 2 pots, so in that way, it's a little different. Also, I'm not lining it with stones. Theirs are always lined with stones up in the Four Corners region, but I don't think those stones are doing you any favors. They're holding on to heat, which makes the pottery cool down slower, but I don't think they're helping the firing in any significant way. So I'm not lining it with stones. 1, because I don't think it does any good. 2, because they all use that, you know, tabular sandstone, which we just don't have around here. A reduction-fired organic painted pottery was made over a broad area of the Southwest, but we only find those trench kilns there in the Four Corners region. I wish I had seen a map. I've never seen one. I'd like to see a map of all the known trench kilns that archaeologists have located, you know, on a map. And then you could overlay that with a map of where reduction-fired organic painted pottery was made traditionally. And you can see that, you know, the area where it was made is much larger than the area where trench kilns are found. This is just kind of a rough idea of where that would be. I've never seen it actually plotted, you know, using archaeological data. So that would be interesting, because I know a lot of people in the Southwest were firing in smothered pits, just like I'm doing here, or like they did in the Four Corners region, but they weren't lining it with sandstone. And that's why they're not being found. I think the only reason we found so many kilns in the Four Corners is that stone lining makes those pits stand out. Years later, you know, hundreds of years later, we still see those as we walk across the landscape. Here, if they were firing in pits, which they weren't, but places like this, let's say over in Members Country, very similar to this, you could walk right over an old firing area and you wouldn't notice it because there's no stones to mark, you know, the perimeters of that. You'd have to chop into the ground and you'd probably see, you know, that charred or ashy area. Or maybe there'd be, you know, the soil would be slightly oxidized around it or something where it'd gotten real hot. So anyways, I'm going to try to get these fired. It's going to take probably most of the day because once I smother it, then I have to wait for it to cool to get it out. So that's what we're at. We're out here in the hot, getting it done. And who knows what the outcome will be because, as I said, I've never done this before. So the Kiva jar here was a project of the Ancient Potters Club. That's my weekly Zoom pottery class. And every month we have a different project. So we made a kiva jar recently, which is another Mesa Verde form. The point with this kind of firing is to oxidize the pottery so that it comes out white. If you don't oxidize it, if you smother it too much, if the pit is too small, there's too much cover sherds, too many coals kind of drowning the pots, then the pots come out black or gray. So you want enough oxygen flow to kind of clean up the pots so that the colors are bright, but not so much that you burn out that organic paint. So that's kind of the balancing act here.
Oh, son of a gun! Scare me to death.
An explosion of that sort is almost always caused by moisture in the clay body. So that means I didn't preheat them thoroughly. In fact, the problem with this whole firing is the heat. It's so hot and humid out here that I find myself cutting corners and trying to get things done more quickly than I should. When you're firing, you should take the time to get it right. So now that I have it all smothered, I have to wait a few hours for it to cool while I'm going for a walk.
Okay, this has been smothered for several hours. I would wait a little longer, but you might hear in the background there's thunder. There's a storm approaching and it looks like a big one. So I'm gonna try to get these out of here and get on the road before the storm gets here. So I am opening it a little early. Now, what are we expecting, right? We heard that big explosion early on. So probably the kiva jar blew up, probably from lack of preheating enough, which I was sloppy with. And I was sloppy with a lot of this firing. Honestly, once I got the pottery set over the coals, I realized that my hole was too deep. What I should have done at that point was put more earth in there, build a second primary fire on top of that new earth, wait for that to burn the coals, and then, you know, do this all over again. It would have set me back at least an hour, possibly more, and so I didn't. I was rushed today. I was rushed early on because it was so hot. I was trying to cut corners just to keep from being out in the sun, you know, suffering from the heat. Which is a bad idea, really bad. And I'm not telling you this to make excuses for my failure, because I think we're gonna find some failure in here. I'm telling you that because I'm trying to learn from it, and hopefully you can learn from this as well. You wanna fire at a time when not only do you have the time to give this, you know, all day if you need to, but also where the conditions are right so you don't have to rush, right? So if it's really hot or if there's an oncoming storm, you have to rush, and then you may make mistakes and your pottery may not come out as good as you'd like. I'm worried that they were buried a little deep. I'm worried that I had a lot, maybe too much cover sherds on there, so I maybe didn't oxidize all the carbon off of them. Maybe I didn't even fire them hot. I don't know. We're gonna find out. Definitely something blew up. So let's get this opened up and see what we got. There's the cover sherds right there. Whew. That dirt is crazy hot. Oh, the mug blew up, definitely. Oh, the mug blew up, and it is dark. It is very dark. Whew! It's toast. I'll show you that closer in a minute. Oh my gosh. The kiva jar also exploded, and it is also quite dark. Interesting. Whew, just trying to make sure I don't have any cover sherds in here that I need to pick up and take with me. Otherwise I can just bury this whole thing, but I don't want to lose any cover sherds. Yikes, it's hot in there. Okay, mug first. I have no idea why it exploded. I really felt like I preheated this good. But obviously that was the big explosion we heard. And in places, like towards the handle, it's a little whiter, but it's still pretty dark. And the organic paint didn't do much in those areas. I'll show you a cleaned up version at the end of the video, but it doesn't look like the organic paint did much even in the places where it isn't black. There are places in here where I didn't even burn off all the organic paint, so didn't oxidize enough down in there. Like I said, quite deep, way too much cover sherds. It was in this little bubble in there. It needs to oxidize. Clint Swink called this style of pottery firing limited oxidation for a reason, because you need to get enough oxygen in there to oxidize off the gray areas, to burn off the top of the paint, but not to burn it all the way out. So showing my lack of experience with this Mesa Verde style, what I'm going to do is I'm going to make another one of these real fast. I'll bring it to the kiln conference and I'll have the experts fire it so you can see how it's actually done if you watch that video, which will come out, you know, a month and a half from now. So make sure you're subscribed. Let me show you that kiva jar now. You know what, I just realized I never found the lid for this at all, unless it's in my pile of cover sherds, but I don't think so. So I don't even know what happened there. There's two big explosions here. You can see them blow out here, but on the inside they were literally blowing out. You can't quite see it this way. Again, there's places like the pot of the mug where it's a little bit good. It's kind of whitish, and you can clear off the ash and you get black designs, but really poor, really poor. Now this one was slipped with stinking springs, and the other was slipped with cannonball. So different slips, and that might make a difference on how, you know, I got more blacks on this than I do on the mug. But they're both pretty much ruined. So that's where I'm at. Like I said, it's my first time doing this, and obviously I made some mistakes here. Also, I was rushed because of the heat, so there you have it. As I said, I will do one of these Mesa Verde style pots. I will get it fired correctly at the kiln conference. So if you catch my video in about a month, you can see how the actual firing is supposed to happen in an actual trench kiln. Now, you see that storm back there, and it's rumbling like crazy. I'm ready to get out of here. I appreciate you coming with me today out here. I will catch you next time.